Now, just a little warning before we begin, there's going to be some major spoilers in this video for the 9th episode of Season 3 of The Bad Batch. So if you haven't seen it yet and you don't want anything ruined, it is a really good time to click away. Alright, so as many suspected after how last week's episode ended with Fennec Shand contacting a mysterious character about the Bad Batch wanting to learn what M count is, this did indeed turn out to be the somehow Ventress returns episode that was essentially spoiled for us when she showed up at the end of the trailer a few months back and before the season even started. And since seeing her there and knowing she was coming back, and assuming it wasn't going to be a flashback to the Clone Wars or something along those lines, which I suppose it could have been, there's been a lot of us, especially those who have read the book Dark Disciple, which was based on some unfinished Clone Wars episodes, and is where Ventress is killed by Dooku. Anyway, there's been a lot of us wondering how she'll be alive in this show, considering that death. Now, the easy explanation, though not the one everyone would have necessarily appreciated, again, especially those who have read that aforementioned book and enjoyed it, was that they were simply going to ignore that book or pretend it never happened. It's not like that hasn't been done before, books and comics being essentially retconned. However, we knew or were told ahead of time that wasn't going to be the case, not after Brad Rao, who is the supervising director of the show. He was asked about all of this, about Ventress being in the trailer and potentially coming back from the dead, and said, "We don't want to spoil anything, but want fans to know that any new storytelling with Ventress will align with the events of Star Wars Dark Disciple." And if you thought that meant we'd be getting an explanation for her return, well, we certainly didn't get that, though we did get a sort of acknowledgement of her death when she said this towards the end of the episode.
I've got a few lives left.
And I figure that was essentially their way of aligning with the book, to not pretend it didn't happen, but to also give you no clue how it did. Though in all fairness, I guess, it probably would have felt rather odd or forced, no pun intended, to have her death and rebirth come up in a sort of discussion with the Bad Batch or Omega. I mean, maybe when Omega and her were out on the boat and she was trying to see if Omega could kind of reach out to all the life around them and then showed her how it's done, maybe you put some sort of line in there about it, not that directly explains it or even necessarily refers to it, but that talks about the thin line between life and death and how her people, how the Night Sisters have ways to cross it. Though, I mean, even that feels kind of forced and out of place, but at least it kind of offers fans not exactly an explanation, but a better acknowledgement than the one we got. I don't know. Either way, I'm sure some people or fans out there are probably really excited and happy about this, and they're saying they don't need or care about the explanation. They don't know why people have to be so upset about this or worry so much about all this. They're just happy to have an episode with Asajj Ventress in it because she's one of their favorite characters or something along those lines. And if that's how you feel about all this, that's great. More power to you. You can love the return of Asajj Ventress. I have no ill will towards you. But I do think fans have every right to be kind of upset about this or want an explanation after the rise of Skywalker and how they handled the return of Palpatine in it.
Somehow Palpatine returned.
That you're just supposed to accept characters coming back from the dead as if it doesn't make death feel meaningless or cheap in a way, or make it feel like nothing has any real stakes anymore. I'd also argue it begins to undermine the story of the prequels, where Anakin feared the death of Padme because, yeah, it is something pretty permanent and not easy to avoid or come back from, if you will. And honestly here, I kind of wish Asajj didn't even say her 9 lives line about how she's got some lives left. I think I'd rather they have her say nothing at all about it because that just felt kinda cheap in a way. Or like they were just trying to placate the fans who want some answers. And sure, there's every chance, or good chance, this isn't the last time we will see Ventress this season, and maybe we will get an explanation for her return from the dead in that episode, or maybe, almost a little ironically, it'll eventually all get explained in a sort of sequel book to Dark Disciple. All we know is that Star Wars even tweeted out that yes, we will get an explanation, and we even got a quote here from Jennifer Corbett about it. But anyway, for now, let's move on from all that and talk a little bit about the episode itself. And I say a little bit because, in all reality, it wasn't exactly the most exciting or eventful episode of the season. Sure, there was some cool action at one point when the Bad Batch takes on Ventress, though it kind of gave me flashbacks to that Acolyte trailer. But beyond that, we kind of tread water story-wise. This really did feel more like an excuse to bring Ventress back than anything else. I mean, sure, we seem to have it confirmed that Omega isn't Force sensitive, though do note that, as we've learned, and is also the real reason the Empire wants her, that her blood can accept M-count transfers, meaning at some point in the future, she could be injected with high M-count blood, maybe from Ventress herself, and she becomes Force sensitive that way, and thus will ultimately need to be trained by Ventress, and there's your next animated show, perhaps. That's what this episode could basically be, not so covertly setting up. Though, as the Ahsoka series told us, high M count doesn't necessarily matter, does it? Anyone can still be trained to use the Force. And along those same lines, I couldn't help but notice how Ventress said of midi-chlorians that those who have a high M count are believed to be more capable of wielding the Force, which sure could just be her stance or belief on it, or could be seen as playing more into this idea that anyone can be trained to use the Force. Along with this, Ventress also points out how the midi-chlorians exist in every living thing. They're actually in every single living cell, which again makes one have to ask how hard it would actually be to figure out what an M count is. I'd even have to imagine with how important they are to the existence of life, that they are required for life, that pretty much every biology textbook in the Star Wars galaxy would talk about them at great length. And them being left out feels like the equivalent of a biology textbook here on Earth never bringing up the mitochondria. It's like missing the key ingredient that makes it all possible. And as someone said in the comments of last week's video, you would really think you could hop on the HoloNet and do the Star Wars equivalent of a Google search and learn what an M count is. Or you could, oh I don't know, you could ask AZ, the medical droid, what an M count is. Seems like something he should know, or at the very least have a clue about, right? But either way, dropping that for now, after learning the basics about midi-chlorians, that it's kind of the Jedi thing, they all pretty much assume that the reason the Empire would then be interested in Omega is because they believe her to have a high M count, and Asajj brings up how the Kaminoans made millions of clones, so it's possible that sure, one of them did indeed end up with a high count. And so, after a little persuading from Omega herself, as well as some doubts and fears from the Bad Batch, who did indeed recognize her as a separatist assassin from the war, and I did like how Asajj overhears them talking and sort of sends Omega away on a test, so she won't be around when they have their little conflict. Anyway, yes, Asajj eventually agrees to test Omega, but not by doing the blood sample thing, which, sure, maybe she doesn't have the device handy that Qui-Gon and Obi-Wan did in the prequels, that's fine. And so instead she does it the old school way of putting her through some Force tests. One of which, as mentioned before, was done out in the boat, and after Omega fails it or can't feel anything, Asajj shows her how it's done, and attracts a bunch of bioluminescent fish that circle the boat. Problem is there's always a bigger fish, and of course we get our pretty much weekly big monster attack at this point. After the test, then, Ventress determines Omega doesn't have a high M count, though at the end both Hunter and Crosshair seem to believe she could be lying, and though Asajj doesn't admit that, she does ask what part do they think she's lying about, leading us to believe that, yeah, she's not entirely being honest here, and that Ventress thinks something is up with Omega, and that is basically how this episode goes and ends. Though, on another note, or another way you could sort of argue this aligns with Dark Disciple, is that Asajj is quite clearly a much different person than when we first see her in the early days of the Clone Wars. I think we all remember what she has done to some previous clone troopers she's encountered. And yet here she doesn't kill or seem to have any interest in killing or hurting the Bad Batch, though clearly she could have if she wanted to. And even though, yes, we start to see that change in her during the later seasons of the Clone Wars, it does sort of get brought to fruition in Dark Disciple when she falls in love with Quinlan Vos. She even gives her life to save him, or temporarily gives her life to save him, when she pushes Vos out of the way of Dooku's Force Lightning and takes the hit herself. And so again, you can kind of argue this does feel like a continuation from that book, other than the dying part, of course. This is a kinder, gentler Asajj Ventress, even when compared to the last time we saw her in the Clone Wars and how she sort of helps Ahsoka in Season 5. Now, that isn't to say I love the idea of bringing her back from the dead, which is what is very much implied. Again, by her saying she has a few lives left, she's implying that, yes, she has died before. It's only to say this episode works with the character she becomes in that book. And so, in closing here, if you love Asajj Ventress, you probably either loved or hated this episode. You may love it because, well, she's alive and you get to see her again and we'll see more of her. Or maybe you hate it because you read that book and felt like that was a pretty good ending for the character. But clearly, there is no end in sight for Ventress. I don't think they brought her back in the Bad Batch for a one-off Treadwater episode, and again, that tweet from Star Wars kind of confirms that. They undoubtedly have future plans for her, and something tells me we could be seeing her in the next animated series, whatever that turns out to be. But excluding all that and just talking about this episode for what it is, I'd say it's one of the weaker episodes of the season, actually. Which is a real shame because this season has been and still is pretty fantastic. It's been firing on all cylinders week in and week out. Again, it just kind of feels like nothing really happens, or we learn something that could have and should have taken our characters a minute on the HoloNet to learn about. I just have a hard time believing M-Count would be something secretive and unknown to most when it's so crucial to the existence of life. Which isn't to say I think everyone understands or it's widely known how important it is to using the Force, but I mean, it's not like these things are invisible in the cells and can only be seen by Jedi or something. They're right there, out in the open, in every single living cell for any biologist to see and examine and study and so on. I don't know, it wasn't a horrible episode, and sure, there is a part of me that enjoyed seeing Ventress again, who loves the possibilities her return heralds. But there's another part of me that enjoyed Dark Disciple and believes that death, more often than not, should be a permanent thing in Star Wars. That this was kind of a cheap way to maybe draw some attention to the show, when the show itself this season has been excellent and not in need of cheap gimmicks like this. Well, that's all I got for you this time. Now it's your turn to take to the comments below and tell me what you thought of this episode. And what do you think of the return of Ventress? Are you excited about it, or do you think it's kind of ridiculous? Or maybe you're waiting to see how it all gets explained. And again, according to a tweet from Star Wars, it is going to get explained. Whatever the case may be, though, leave those comments below and let's talk some Star Wars. And until next time, thanks for watching.